Hello, my name is Carol Galloway, and today we're going to be discussing motivation in the forms of causal attribution theory, goal setting, and goal orientation theory. I'm an educator with more than 15 years of experience, and I hope that what I'm going to talk about today will be useful to you in your classroom and perhaps beyond that. So we'll begin today by talking about causal attribution theory. So, causal attribution theory is a pretty old theory that goes back to Fritz Heider, who in the 1950s came up with a pretty simplistic understanding of why do people think they have succeeded or failed at a particular issue. They either feel that they have the ability to do something, that is, that they can, or that they have tried to do something. That idea was really expanded upon by Bernard Weiner throughout the 1970s up to the early 2000s. Um, these works really come to three major points. Um, Causal attribution theory really works on the notion that when individuals think about their successes and failures, they are primarily thinking about to what do they attribute their cause of success or failure. And they are often thinking about the location of success or failure being internal to themselves or external to themselves, the controllability of that success or failure. That is, was it something they could put their hands on and fix? Or was it something outside of themselves that they can't touch, that they have no control over? Or is it something that is changeable? Is it something that's stable that they can never make any alteration to? Or is it unstable that they can potentially reform and make better? So, understanding the basics of causal attribution theory, I decided to undertake an active motivation for a friend of mine who I will refer to by the initial M. M is unfortunately going through a bit of a rough patch. A parent of theirs is experiencing a serious illness, and therefore I decided to try and motivate M to seek out a therapist to seek support during this difficult period. Unfortunately, M has been reluctant for multiple reasons to seek a therapist, but mostly insisting that they were, quote, not good at therapy. This insistence that they were not good at therapy really struck me as a space where potentially causal attribution theory could be useful. So what I did was the following. First of all, I was very clear with my friend what I was doing. I explained the basics of causal attribution theory to them. And then I showed them a short video that I had recorded with the help of a friend of mine who is also a therapist. My therapist friend does not know M, and I did not give them any details about M. The video we recorded was about my experience finding a therapist, both the challenges and positives of that. And my therapist friend explained kind of the positives and negatives of intaking new clients and what they wished new clients knew about the experience. After showing that video to M, I then gave my friend a time to write a list of at least 5 steps to take in terms of trying to find a therapist. This was a relatively successful undertaking. M wrote more than the 5 steps that I requested, and I am happy to report that they thus far have actually requested a appointment with a therapist. So that is a positive. The strategy that I was primarily using with M was something called antecedent retraining. So antecedent retraining is the notion that prior to a task that might be particularly challenging or intimidating to a learner, what you do is you have individuals who have completed the task and either succeeded or failed at the task. You have them discuss their challenges and why they think they were challenged or succeeded at that task. You could have them do this on paper, you could have them do this on a video. The example that was given that I was referencing was a recorded video, which is why I recorded a video. But this is a really useful system because what it does is it provides a model for learners moving forward. It shows them that while the upcoming event might be challenging, there is a potential for the role of effort, not simply ability. So the idea here is to have people talking about, yes, this is hard, but here's how I got through it, or yeah, that was hard and I didn't do so well, but I'm pretty sure the reason I didn't do well is because of X, Y, and Z, not just because it's really hard and I'm real dumb. What you want to be able to show students is that there is a thing that effort does. That effort and strategy can help move through a challenge. And that can have a really beneficial outcome in terms of kind of reframing the attribution for students. So that's really important. A second motivational strategy that you can use with causal attribution is something called effort and ability retraining, which is actually something that I've done in my classroom. I just never knew the title of it before. So this is where you deliberately attempt to shift the learner's perception of cause from a stable cause, like ability, to something that is unstable, like your amount of effort. So rather than praising success on ability, saying, oh, what a wonderful job on your quiz, Grace. You're so smart. You say, Grace, you did such a great job on this last quiz. I can tell that you really worked. I can tell that you really drilled on your vocabulary and it paid off. Naming the specific effort and really framing it in terms of effort when you give praise is much more important than praising specific ability. Similarly, when you are giving feedback, it is not a bad thing necessarily if that feedback is targeting failures, if you are talking about it in terms of effort in a way that is constructive. So if you are talking about it, well, not your strongest performance on a test thus far. Look, you did quite well on this portion of the test, but I can tell that once you got to question 27, your attention started to wander. And then it doesn't look like you put as much effort into it here. Did you decide to stop? What happened after this point? And pointing out that like there's a decline in effort, or that I can tell you didn't study this particular topic, that matters quite a lot, instead of just targeting a student's ability. I just don't think you're good at this. That sort of feedback is very productive for students in terms of motivation. What this does is it encourages a shift away from learned helplessness and gives students a sense of self-efficacy, that they can actually change things. And this is really important for motivation. So it encourages that growth mindset, and all of that is really important. So ultimately, when we are thinking about uses of causal attribution theory in the classroom and beyond, one important thing I would consider is that self-talk matters quite a lot, that it's really important for students to practice that positive self-talk, that emphasis on, I'm going to give this my best effort. And if that effort fails, to think about it in terms of a not yet rather than a, well, that just blew up in the hangar sort of way. We also need to think as educators about common attribution errors, because this is really important to us. So attribution errors, we need to think about in terms of, it's really, really common for individuals, when we are judging ourselves when we fail at something, to put the blame on failure externally, to think about blame being fully exterior to ourselves. Whereas whenever we are examining failure in others, we very frequently look at that failure as innate and inborn to that person. And that is almost inevitably an incorrect evaluation on both sides of the equation. There's usually more nuance to it than that. So those are really common attribution errors that we need to be cognizant of as educators, and give a little bit more grace to our students. We also need to be cognizant of cultural differences with regards to things like collectivist and individualist cultures, because that does affect the way that our students see successes and failures, and the way that they understand what is driving those successes and failures. failures, whether or not they think that the failure is coming from themselves or from external forces. We really do need to think about those cultural and familial backgrounds. For me, as an educator, knowing more about causal attribution theory means that I need to give more focused feedback based on process and effort to my students, because that's more actionable, it's more beneficial to them. Writing a great job on a paper doesn't help if I'm not giving them specific ideas about like what the actual effort is. And I really do think that I want to give my students an opportunity at the end of every unit to reflect on their successes and failures, to consider what challenges they encountered and what they think they could have done better. And then next year, use those reflections as jumping off points for my students at the start of the same unit, as antecedent retrainings before the unit begins, and see how that goes. So another type of motivational theories that we've looked at here is goal setting and goal orientation theory. So goal setting and goal orientation theory is really, in a lot of ways, quite straightforward. We know that goal setting and having distinct specific goals for students and their achievements is really important, whether they come up with them themselves or whether or not they're given to them by their instructors. What is important is student buy-in. We also know that it's really important to understand the reasons why individuals are pursuing goals, whether or not they are pursuing them for mastery reasons or performance reasons. That is, whether or not the reasons that they are pursuing their goals is innate or based on a desire to be perceived as having performed those goals correctly. There's also a subdivision beyond that: mastery performance and mastery avoidance, performance approach and performance avoidance. What that means is that very often individuals will pursue goals to approach mastery, meaning that they want to pursue a goal because they are trying to master a goal. They want to achieve it in a positive sense, but they may want to the reason that they may be moving towards a goal is because they are performance avoidance oriented, which means that they don't want to be seen to fail. And that's a different reason for moving towards a goal. And it has different consequences to it. So understanding what's motivating a student to move towards a goal is also really important. So as part of my motivating activities here, what I did was, as an active motivation, I worked to encourage my sister, C, to reestablish a language study routine in Spanish. C at one point was approaching quite good fluency in Spanish, but has let her language study lapse over the last decade. And that has bothered her, and she is expressed an interest in reestablishing that language fluency, but just hasn't made the time for it. So what I did as an active motivation for her was I established a long-term goal setting worksheet for her, along with some sub goals, so that she could work out some distal and proximate goals. And then I presented her with multiple options that she could choose from that would help her to achieve those language learning goals. So this is tied to two primary motivating strategies within goal setting and goal orientation theory. So the first of the theories that I'm looking at here is something called a process goal. So process goals are pretty straightforward. What you're trying to do here is you establish a specific, measurable, long-term goal, sometimes called distal goal. And in this particular case, what I did with my sister was I actually had a goal setting form that I have used before with my homeroom students at school, that has a long-term goal at the top. And one of the things that we work on is we come up with specific measurable goals. It needs to be something that it can't just be, I want to get better at math. It needs to be very specific. So one of the things she wanted to do was she wanted to be able to read academic level article without having to look up any words. That was a specific measurable goal. She would be able to know if she had done it, and she wanted to be able to do it by January of this coming year. So those are her timelines. That's her distal goal in terms of literacy. So those are her specific goals. And then in order to meet that distal goal, you establish specific short-term proximate goals that will help to build towards the long-term goal. So maybe on a weekly basis, what are the things that you will do that will help you get to that distal goal? So on the worksheet that I made for her, she named, on a weekly basis, I am going to do X, Y, and Z in order to get to these things. And then what's really a critical important of all of this is accountability and check-ins, that you need to check in on your process and evaluate. You need to see whether or not you are regularly achieving these goals. Another motivational strategy you can use here is target. Target is an acronym that stands for task, authority, recognition, grouping, evaluation, and timing. So broadly what this means is that you are looking at the task you are undertaking, whether or not it is challenging, useful, the authority that learners have, do they have choice and leadership and the ability to make decisions about what they're learning. You're looking for recognition. Are learners recognized for their effort and their improvement? You're looking at grouping. Are they appropriately grouped to be collaborative and cooperative? And are the groupings heterogeneous? What you don't want is you don't want groups based on ability that are segregated out. How are they evaluated? Are the evaluations private? That is, they're not being humiliated by having that information shared. Are they varied? Do they appropriately assess progress? And does the timing of the lesson and the learning make sense? Are students allowed to complete assignments at the appropriate time? By using a strategy like Target, students will be more motivated in terms of their goal setting and their ability to move forward. So one of the most important things that I found moving forward was that we can't assume that all learners know how to develop a goal. I know this from my own practice as an educator. Students come to us with varying backgrounds. They don't always know how to write a goal. We would assume perhaps in high school they would, they don't. And it's not a problem. That is something that we can teach them how. Goal commitment is as important as specificity. It is really important that students learn how to commit to a goal, and it's very closely tied to self-efficacy. That is, it's very often tied to being oriented towards mastery approach in terms of your goal orientation instead of performance approach. That it needs to be internally important to you that you get this done. It is also really important that students see us model goal setting, that we do it collectively as a group, and maybe that they see you as their teacher set goals, and that you check in on goal setting with fidelity, that if you have them write individual goals, you call them over on a regular basis and say, let's see how we're doing. Let's check on those, weekly goals and see how we're following through. It's really also important that if you're not making those checkpoints on goals, that you approach it with a not yet attitude rather than a failure-based attitude. That you evaluate it with, well, what can we do to move the needle forward, rather than a, well, now you're behind sort of attitude. That this is really important for that growth mindset, that students need to see forward progress. So what can we do to move things forward? So in terms of concluding, so where do we go from here? Well, I think it's really important for us to always remember why students consider the reasons for their own success and failures. I think that we need to hold that in our heads and our hearts when we consider what changes we can make in our classrooms. And I think that we always need to consider the importance of metacognition. It's really important for students to learn to think about what they're thinking. That self-reflection piece is really important for them moving forward. And I think that one of the most important things for all of us is transparency, authenticity, and choice, not just for ourselves, but for our students. Thank you so much, and I hope you have a great day.